Welcome to a bonus episode of Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's July 27th, 2025. Let's get to it. China moves to fill a soft power vacuum and dominate UN standard-setting bodies like the ITU and WHO. In the wake of U.S. retrenchment from multilateral institutions, China has significantly expanded its influence within the United Nations. Leveraging increased funding, strategic staffing, and diplomatic coalitions, especially with developing countries, China is reshaping UN priorities in favor of development. Its effects are particularly visible in Geneva, Switzerland, where the UN is based, through agencies like the World Health Organization, WHO, and the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, the latter which sets global communication standards. So there's this idea of soft power. There's a term that was coined in the 1980s by political scientist Joseph Nye Jr., but it's really something that's been going on since the end of World War II, and maybe even before. And it's defining the country's ability to influence others without resorting to coercive pressure, projecting values, ideals, culture, cross-border, and fostering goodwill and building partnerships. So you think contrasted with hard power, which is military force, and also listed as economic sanctions. I always thought of that more of a soft power, but it moves into the hard power realm. And then soft power is more cultural things, music, food, sports, other exports, and goodwill that help bolster your international reputation. So, Sue, what are some of your thoughts on China stepping up and providing some more resources here to the UN and the rest of the world?
So I think there's super good reason to be concerned, and I think it's just a continuation of an approach they're taking. China sees this as their strategic moment, and different from how Russia sees that, which is undermining free and open societies, particularly that practiced by the West. China really believes that it can seize global leadership and can outcompete us using positioning on international bodies and trade deals with countries as their way to do it. They're doing this as the exact moment that the U.S. is pulling away from the same things, right? Again, I will say America first cannot be American only, but too many things are just our interest and feel to me like we're missing both what China is doing on this front and how important this front is in the world we have today. I talk a lot about what the impact of an increasingly digital world is. One of those is economic security becomes national security. The other thing is the nature of relationships that for so long was predicated on, say, the U.S. providing physical protection and now is much more situational and much more economic leverage than it's ever been. So I think what's interesting is now to take it back to this article and seeing China really make a move in the UN is just a continuation of seeking more influence. And even though they're second to the U.S., man, that's a big move for them to be able to do it.
They've been the second highest spender. 15% of the UN's budget comes from China, second only to us, the United States, at 22%. Yet they remain understaffed and underrepresented in the amount of staff in those organizations. So some of it is a natural, just starting to pull your weight and carry the water. But I think it's very strategic on their part, like you said, because there are opportunities here for them to fill the void and create that goodwill and investment, because ultimately they want other developing countries to buy their stuff, their infrastructure, their equipment, their stack. And we talked about that a little bit more with the NVIDIA article, but the Digital Silk Road and some of their Belt and Road initiative is what I'm thinking here.
Yeah, and they're offering real money when we are offering less so. And even what we decide to export, when we deny exports of even weapon systems, there are now countries that always used to turn to us who are now turning to Russia and China to provide those weapons. I've got a really fascinating example. There's a big conference called the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is held in Singapore annually, although Now I guess the DoD won't be supporting it
Not traveling. Yep.
traveling
No think
anymore.
tanks.
But big conference, everyone is there. Everyone, the U.S. is there, China's there, allies, partners in the region are there, just talking about geopolitics and technologies. I'm going to say 3 years ago, I was there, and one of the most interesting things was when the president of Singapore basically, in a big open speech, made a moral equivalence between the United States and China in terms of malign activity, particularly in cyber. And everyone turned and looked at their U.S. friends like, did you just hear that? The next day, went and talked to the president. I'm like, okay, that's what you said publicly because you're just trying to, succeed in ASEAN. You don't mean that? And he said, yeah, I do. And I said, but look at all we give you in terms of military support, and we are different in terms of doing it. He said, yeah, but let me tell you how much China's giving us in terms of economic support for non-military things. So I think there's a huge shift in terms of what you want. Djibouti is offered $1 billion for a deep water port, even though Djibouti is a nation that we have had a lot of things with. I mean, it's just real impact. And they're accepting China's investment, even though they know that there are strings attached to that. So I think it's just a massive way of creating influence and winning competition. And then interesting that at the same time this article came out that article about the cuts at the State Department. And so we're seeing one of our biggest strategic adversaries and competitors investing in softer power, and we're reducing expertise that has been a foundational piece of our soft power, diplomacy, economic, regional expertise. And even within that, in the cuts in the State Department, there were cuts to China expertise. I have a hard time understanding how we are going to counter the strategic positioning that they're doing if we don't have the expertise. And it's not just big economic plays. You mentioned the International Telecommunications Union. The U.S. has historically not sought leadership of international bodies, in part because we believe so much in the private sector and free enterprise, and we've been the leaders, so we don't want to impose on that because it has been in our interest to just be the leaders and whatever we had was the standard. But now you have China all over it, and they're dictating what frequencies we can use in space and what assets that we can put up there. I think this is just a really interesting moment for the U.S. to take a pretty good, hard view at what China particularly is doing in the use of soft power at exactly the moment when they're also making moves for positional dominance, both in the South China Sea vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so this is a real concerning issue, and I think it will challenge the U.S. to decide whether it wants to stay on the path of basically withdrawal or whether it has to reinvest a bit in being a global leadership player.
Right? How much can you rely on just that de facto leadership? And this is not entirely new, right? They've had their base across from Camp Lemonnier and Djibouti as long as I can remember. They were doing infrastructure projects in Jordan 10 years ago. Some of our allies are equal opportunity, right? They're looking for money and investment in their country. And why would you turn down help if you're a country trying to advance yourself? But I think to your point about losing expertise at the State Department, it harkens back to some of these deals that we're making. These letters that are signed and put out as far as deals with countries on tariffs, that's not the end of it. There's a lot of work that goes into finalizing these deals, getting these arrangements, all these things that happens at the State Department, right, and the other government agencies. And when you lose and reduce some of that expertise, you're exposing yourself. And so I think we've been the first to say sometimes that, sure, we need to restructure and we need to reevaluate if some of these organizations need to exist. But this is one I think we need to keep an eye on.
There is a difference in the deals that they're making. Now, again, I think not every trade deal is just about the trade, but it's about influence. One of the great strengths of America has been we have friends. But if you look at China's insinuation into the global South, just how present they are in Africa, a source of rare earth minerals, or in our own backyard in South America, a source of great natural resources and great global positioning. It may be that it is trade deals that they're affecting, but it is influence they're achieving. And again, I always hope peace will break out everywhere. But as the world's resources are more strained, populations are more disenfranchised, boy, I just think the influence China is achieving through its relatively uncountered, actually, it's even more than uncountered. We're just not competing in the same way as they are in the same places. So again, it's a choice. But then to tie it back to your expertise, you really need to think about the second order, third order effects that are building over time when you make these choices about whether the talent you have assessing or how you're treating your friends and allies.
We'll be watching if you can maintain a sphere of influence through just market forces. There is an opportunity cost of providing AIDS relief and USAID and other medical services and vaccines and things like that. But how much goodwill, what's the trade-off? How much goodwill is there when a country sees U.S. on the side, America versus the PRC?
Yeah, I don't think we can underestimate how our presence in those bodies, even when we don't put massive resources, allows other aligned democratic societies to say, great, if the U.S. is there, we can align with them. When the U.S. isn't there, then they have a different choice to make because they don't want to be punished in the economic realm.
That's what we're watching. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
Thank you for joining us. As always, remember, we're here for you. Look for a link to the show notes to provide feedback or suggest topics for the next time. I'm told that feedback is a gift, and Eric and I both believe it because we give each other feedback a lot. Join us next week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another.